He received a house deep in the forest from an old friend, but he didn't know that hidden under the roof was the reason why the millionaire was watching his every move. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. Samuel Doyle had never expected his life to narrow tack quietly, as if each passing year folded itself into a smaller and smaller room. At 72, he had learned to live with constraints, the stiffness in his left knee from a piece of metal that doctors swore they had removed, the shortness of breath on cold mornings, the dull ache in his hands every time the temperature dropped a few degrees. Pain was not a stranger to him. It was the companion that walked behind him, silent but faithful, reminding him of the war he had survived and of the friend he had lost. Long before he understood how deeply that loss would echo through the years. He lived alone in a small single-story house, squeezed between an auto workshop and a vacant lot scattered with broken pallets. The house creaked when the wind hit it. The heating rattled before it warmed. The windows sweated every winter morning. But Samuel did not complain. Complaints felt like a waste of air. His nightly job as a security guard in the workshop paid little, but it paid enough to buy coffee, a roof over his head, and the occasional can of chicken soup. He woke up early, sipping instant coffee from a chipped mug as he watched the light creep across the street, and walked slowly to the workshop, where he relieved the younger guard who always arrived half an hour late and smelling of energy drinks. Inside Samuel's house hung only 2 photographs. One showed him and Tom Raines during their deployment in a sandy hell of noise, smoke, and burning sun. Both looked impossibly young, faces unshadowed, shoulders square, eyes sharp. The second photo was taken decades later, the 2 men grinning in civilian clothes at a dusty roadside diner somewhere between their hometowns. That photograph had been taken before life pulled them apart again, before family obligations, work, and separate states made their meetings rare. Tom had died 2 years ago, and although Samuel had mourned him, the world had remained stubbornly unchanged. No grand shifts, no revelations, just the steady march of days. Which is why, on a frigid morning in late December, when Samuel found a thick white envelope in his mailbox, he stood at the edge of his porch longer than usual. The return address belonged to a law office. For a moment his breath snagged, and he wondered if this was yet another administrative mistake, something about his veteran benefits, or a misplaced bill. But once inside, with the heater buzzing weakly and his glasses perched on the tip of his nose, he opened the envelope and read the lines that made his hands tremble despite the room's warmth. He was being summoned to the reading of Tom Raines's will. Samuel reread the letter several times, letting its weight settle. Tom had been gone for 2 years, his funeral small and subdued, attended by family members Samuel had never met, and by Samuel himself, the one friend from the old days who had remained. Why would there be unfinished legal business now? Why would Tom include him in anything beyond the condolences they had already exchanged with the Raines family after the funeral? The invitation felt like a door being pushed open from somewhere in the past. 2 days later, he found himself seated in a polished wooden chair in an office that smelled of lemon oil and old leather. Around him sat the Raines family, Tom's nephews in clean flannel shirts, an older sister wearing a stiff cardigan, and a handful of younger relatives who watched Samuel with curiosity that bordered on suspicion. He felt their surprise settle on him like dust, as though none of them could quite understand what business an elderly black man had in their affairs. The lawyer cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began reading. Most of Tom's possessions, vehicles, savings, farm equipment, household items, were distributed among family members. Nothing surprising there. But then the lawyer paused, glanced at Samuel, and continued in a measured voice. "One property remains," he said. "The parcel of forest land in the northern ridge, including the elevated structure known as the Raines treehouse. As per Mr. Raines's written instruction, this property is to be transferred in full to Mr. Samuel Doyle. The room shifted. Heads turned. One nephew muttered something under his breath. The older sister's eyebrows lifted so sharply that Samuel thought they might fly off her forehead. The lawyer raised a hand for silence. In Mr. Raines's own words, he read, "This land belongs to the one man who once saved my life, and who understands the weight of keeping a promise. If anyone should protect it, it's him." The silence that followed was dense and uncomfortable. Someone coughed. The older sister leaned forward, clearly wanting to object. But the lawyer closed the file with a firm, dry snap that ended all discussion. Samuel left the office with the weight of those words pressing into him. He had not expected anything from Tom, least of all land. Certainly not land described as remote, deep in the winter mountains, reachable only by hiking for several hours. But what unsettled him more than the distance was the feeling that Tom had left him something unfinished, something that had not been resolved before death, a legacy that felt less like a gift and more like a responsibility. 2 days later, he packed a modest backpack, gloves, an old army jacket, socks, a thermos, a flashlight, and a map the lawyer had printed for him. The map marked the forest property on the northern ridge, far outside any maintained path. The lawyer had placed another warning. Due to early winter storms, the area was difficult to reach, perhaps even dangerous. But Samuel had crossed deserts under fire at 19. He had wandered through jungles and waded through rivers with lead-filled boots. A winter forest, silent and indifferent, did not frighten him. The drive north took half a day. Soon the road narrowed, then grew rougher, then ended entirely at a frozen trailhead. From there, he continued on foot. The forest greeted him with a cold so sharp it seemed capable of splitting the air. Snow lay deep in many places, as if the ground itself had curled into sleep under a heavy blanket. His steps were slow and deliberate. Every few hundred feet, he paused to catch his breath and let the ache in his knee subside. The deeper he moved into the forest, the quieter everything became. Even his thoughts seemed muffled. He remembered walking like this with Tom many years ago. Not here, but in a foreign land none of the young soldiers understood. They had moved in silence then, too, listening for dangers, following instincts sharpened beyond reason. As the wind pushed through the branches overhead, Samuel felt again the presence of those years, as though time had folded and handed him a memory he had not asked to revisit. He climbed past fallen logs and frozen streams, the air growing thinner and colder, the trail vanishing under drifts of untouched snow. When he finally broke through a dense cluster of evergreens and looked up, he stopped. High above him, balanced between the thick arms of 2 colossal pines, stood the Raines family treehouse. It was not a child's hideout or a whimsical wooden hut. It was a full structure, a small cabin suspended in the forest canopy, built with thick timber and heavy beams that looked older than many modern homes. Snow weighted its roof, but the structure stood tall and straight, defying gravity and time alike. A long wooden staircase climbed toward it, its steps glazed with ice, some tilted or cracked, but still intact. The sight was majestic, almost imposing. Samuel felt something shift inside him, something close to awe. He had expected a broken relic. Instead, he found a place that seemed alive. He placed his hand on the first step and felt the cold wood pulse beneath his palm, as though acknowledging him. He climbed cautiously, his gloved hand gripping the rail, his boots testing each step before committing to the next. When he reached the platform, the view stunned him, a sea of winter forest stretching endlessly in every direction, blue shadows between the trees, and pale sunlight flickering across the snow. Inside, the treehouse was dim, but warm in its own way, filled with the scent of old timber and something faintly resinous. Dust coated the table and shelves, and frost clung to the window edges like delicate lace. Yet the place did not feel abandoned. It felt preserved, as though waiting. Samuel walked slowly, touching the back of an old chair, tracing the edges of maps pinned crookedly on the wall. Some were almost a century old, marked with lines and symbols he did not recognize. On a shelf lay several books with cracked leather spines and rusted metal tabs engraved with circular emblems. Beside them were notebooks, Tom's handwriting unmistakable, sharp and slightly slanted. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed and opened one of the notebooks. The first few pages spoke of repairs Tom had made to the structure, weather reports, and mentions of the forest animals he had seen. But deeper in the notebook, the tone changed. Tom wrote of pressure from a man named Richard Montlake, of repeated offers to buy the land, of tensions with local officials, of a fear that something important was slipping through his hands. Then Samuel found a letter, folded between 2 pages, as though it had been waiting for him. His name stood on the first line. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone," Tom had written. "I didn't want to leave you with trouble, Sam. But I also knew that if anything happened to me, this land would be in danger. You once saved my life. I'm asking you to save one last thing for me." Samuel sat for a long time, absorbing each word. The forest outside seemed to lean closer, listening. The silence grew heavy. He placed the letter carefully on the table and looked around the room with new eyes. Someone had been here recently. Near the door, the snow at the threshold had melted unevenly, as if boots had stood there. The latch showed signs of stress, a thin crack where metal met wood. Outside, he could see faint imprints in the snow, long, narrow tracks leading toward the tree line. He felt the old instinct awaken inside him, the one he thought he had buried decades ago. Someone had entered this place before him. Someone who did not belong here. And as the pale sun dipped behind the ridge, casting the forest into a deep blue glow, Samuel Doyle understood something with absolute clarity. He had not come merely to accept an inheritance. He had stepped into a conflict already in motion, a promise already broken, a fight that Tom had carried alone until death. Now the responsibility rested in Samuel's hands, whether he wanted it or not. The night settled over the forest with a weight that pressed against the wooden walls of the treehouse, and Samuel Doyle stood near the narrow window, watching the pale beam of moonlight stretch across the snow. The tracks outside had faded slightly as the temperature dropped, but their direction remained clear. Whoever had approached the house had come deliberately, climbed partway up the ladder, and then walked off into the trees. The forest around him was silent now, too silent, as if waiting for something. Samuel felt the tension coil in his stomach, not fear exactly, but the deep familiar alertness that had once kept him alive in places much harsher than this. Only a fool believed a quiet night was a safe night. By morning, the cold had sharpened, and the windows had grown a crust of frost so thick it blurred the entire forest into a haze of white and gray. The air inside the house was still, laced with the scent of old pine and dust. Samuel warmed his hands over the small propane heater he'd brought, feeling the stiffness of his joints soften just enough to move. He made himself a cup of coffee from instant granules, the bitterness of it reminding him of early mornings during deployment, when the world always felt on edge. As he sipped, he replayed the previous day in his mind, the reading of the will, the long hike, the attic-like stillness of the treehouse, the unsettling tracks outside. He could not yet explain the nature of the danger, but he felt its shape forming. Tom had tried to say something in his notebook, and in that folded letter. The words had been brief, but the message had been unmistakable. The land mattered, deeply, and someone wanted it badly enough to do harm. He put on his jacket and stepped onto the outer platform, the cold air burning in his lungs. The forest was washed in the faint early light that always made winter mornings feel deceptively gentle. Yet the quiet was unnatural. On the ground, the snow held the imprint of heavy boots, leading away from the treehouse and toward a narrow trail Samuel had barely noticed when he had climbed up the night before. He followed the prints with his eyes until they disappeared into the line of trees. When the sound of an engine broke through the silence, Samuel stiffened. It was distant at first, but growing louder, a familiar mechanical snarl cutting through the stillness. He leaned forward, peering between the branches, and soon saw it. A dark snowmobile moving swiftly across the uneven terrain. The rider slowed as he approached the clearing beneath the treehouse. When the engine died, the silence that followed was sharp. The man removed his helmet, revealing a head of thinning gray-blonde hair and narrow, pale eyes. His expensive winter coat and boots looked out of place here, as though he belonged to a boardroom more than a forest. The man surveyed the clearing with the casual arrogance of someone who believed the land belonged to him by default. Samuel did not need an introduction to know who he was. Richard Montlake, he murmured under his breath, tasting the bitterness of the name. Montlake stood with his hands on his hips for a moment, before calling upward, his voice ringing too confidently in the quiet woods. "Mr. Doyle, are you up there? I know you must be. Let's have a little talk." Samuel remained silent for a few seconds, considering whether to answer, but it would be pointless to hide. Whoever had crept to the treehouse the night before had likely been connected to this man, and refusing to speak would only escalate whatever intentions he already carried. He stepped forward just enough to be seen. "I'm here." Montlake smiled up at him in a way that felt both friendly and threatening. "Good morning to you. Quite a walk you had yesterday, I imagine. This place isn't exactly easy to reach in winter." "It wasn't meant to be," Samuel replied, keeping his tone steady. Montlake chuckled lightly, as if they were sharing a private joke. "No, I suppose it wasn't. But it's a special place, isn't it? A real piece of history. I take a particular interest in maintaining the land around here. As a matter of goodwill, of course." Samuel said nothing. Montlake took a few steps closer to the ladder, brushing snow from his sleeves. "I won't waste your time, Mr. Doyle. I heard that Tom left this parcel to you." Touching gesture, really. "But I think we both understand that this land is, frankly, impractical for someone your age to manage. The location, the maintenance, the legal upkeep, complicated business. Burdensome even. Especially given your circumstances." Samuel's jaw tightened at the last word. "My circumstances are mine to deal with." "Of course," Montlake said smoothly. "Of course." He lifted his gaze again, his breath fogging in the cold. "But let me offer you a simple solution. Sell it to me. I'll give you a very fair price. More than that old cabin is worth. You can walk away with a comfortable sum. No headaches, no winter storms, no paperwork." "I'm not selling," Samuel said. The smile on Montlake's face froze, just slightly, before he masked it again. "Are you sure? I don't want you to feel pressured, but this land, and I say this with absolute respect, has been tied to my family's operations for decades. Tom held on to it mostly out of stubbornness." "That's your opinion," Samuel said. "Tom didn't see it that way." Montlake's expression shifted. Something colder entered his eyes. "Tom was a sentimental man, and you seem to be one as well. But sentiment doesn't hold legal weight." "I said I'm not selling," Samuel repeated. Montlake's smile finally cracked. Only for an instant, But Samuel saw it. The irritation, the entitlement, the certainty that the world bent for him, and that this refusal was a minor inconvenience he fully intended to correct. "Well," Montlake said, stepping back and picking up his helmet, "suit yourself. But if you change your mind, I'll be around. And considering the condition of that old structure, you may want to reconsider sooner rather than later. Winter can be unpredictable out here." With that, he mounted the snowmobile and sped off, leaving a harsh trail of churned snow behind him. Samuel watched until the machine vanished into the trees. The last sentence hung in the air like frost. Winter can be unpredictable out here. It was not a warning. It was a threat wrapped in courtesy. The day unfolded slowly after that encounter, but Samuel could not shake the tension from his shoulders. He walked the perimeter of the clearing, noting every footprint, every disturbance in the snow. He found the prints from the previous night again, 3 separate sets, each circling the ladder, but none climbing to the top. He traced the direction they had gone. They led toward the frozen creek beyond the tree line, where the snow had layered thickly enough to blur them. But the implication was clear. Montlake had sent people to inspect the place long before he had shown his own face. Inside the house, Samuel began inspecting everything more carefully. The maps pinned to the wall contained markings he hadn't noticed the night before, boundary lines that did not match the map the lawyer had given him, and small circles with unfamiliar symbols, drawn in a hand that looked much older than Tom's. On one map, the date 1914 was faintly inked in the corner. Beneath the table he found folded papers secured with a brittle leather strap documents from early 20th century land agreements, referencing tribes he only vaguely recognized from history books. The metal tabs engraved with tribal symbols suddenly felt far more significant. He read more of Tom's diary, turning the pages slowly, absorbing the unspoken tension in the words. Tom wrote about meetings with county officials who dismissed his concerns, about surveyors who showed up without his consent, about boundary lines being questioned and redrawn. He wrote about Montlake not just as a neighbor, but as a force gradually suffocating the land around him. One entry read, "He won't stop. He's convinced this land should be his. He'll keep coming until I bend or I break." Another, "They're pushing me everywhere they can. I don't know how much longer I can hold them off without help. Sam would understand." He always did. That sentence stung. It felt like Tom had left behind not just words, but an expectation. A plea. As daylight faded, Samuel heard another sound outside, the sharp crunch of snow and the scuffle of boots. He put down the diary and stepped to the window, careful to stay in the shadows. Below, 2 figures moved through the clearing with flashlights. They were not Montlake. These men wore heavy jackets, their faces hidden behind scarves. They shone their lights at the ladder, the trees, the ground, inspecting the area with the precision of surveyors or scouts. One of them bent down and picked up something from the snow. The other spoke, his voice muffled but tense. Then they turned and walked toward the old shed at the edge of the clearing. Samuel watched as one of them yanked on the handle. The wood groaned. They were testing it, testing how easily they could get inside. Then one of the men kicked the door, testing its resistance. Samuel clenched his jaw, but remained still. After a moment, the men stepped back, whispered something, and headed toward the trail. Their flashlights flickered through the trees until the darkness swallowed them. When silence returned, Samuel stepped away from the window and pressed his palm against the wall. The treehouse felt colder now, vulnerable. He felt a surge of something deep inside, a protective instinct stronger than fear or hesitation. Something Tom had once awakened in him on a battlefield far away. By morning, the shed had been broken open. Samuel found the door splintered near the hinge, and inside the small wooden structure, Papers were scattered across the floor in a deliberate mess. The metal plaques bearing tribal symbols were gone. Copies of some documents were missing. Whoever had come in the night had been searching for something specific, something they either hadn't found or hadn't yet needed. He knelt slowly, sorting through what remained. The air inside the shed was bitterly cold, but the chill Samuel felt ran deeper. This was no casual vandalism. It was a targeted search, carried out by people who knew exactly what they were after. He stood, looking at the damage, and felt a familiar burn in his chest, a heat that had nothing to do with anger or fear. It was resolve, the same resolve that had pushed him forward through explosions and gunfire decades ago. The same resolve that had made him stay up nights, watching over men he barely knew because their lives depended on his vigilance. He walked back toward the treehouse, each breath rising in a small cloud. The snow crunched beneath his boots in a steady rhythm. He felt older than he had the night before, but he also felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of purpose sharpening inside him. Inside the house, he opened the diary again. One passage caught his attention in a new way, something Tom had written almost casually. "If something happens to me, Sam will know where to look. He always understood my grandfather better than anyone else." Samuel frowned. He did not remember ever discussing Tom's grandfather in detail, but he remembered Scrap's comments Tom had made over the years about how the old man built the original structure, how he'd been obsessed with protecting documents, secrets, promises. Tom had once joked that the man believed the sky itself was a safer vault than the ground. "If you want something to be found," Tom had said once with a tired smile, "hide it underfoot. If you never want it found, hide it above their heads." Samuel looked up at the ceiling then, studying the thick beams that crossed the room. One beam in particular, darker than the others, reinforced with metal brackets that did not match the rest of the house's construction, drew his eye. A faint seam ran along its length. He had not noticed it last night, too tired and distracted by the tracks outside. But now, with Tom's words echoing through his mind, he understood. The real secret was in the roof, and whatever Tom had hidden there was the reason men like Montlake wanted this land so desperately. Samuel felt the cold tighten around him again. The danger was no longer vague. It had shape now, direction, and intent. The war he had left behind decades ago was calling him back in a different form. And this time, the battlefield was a silent winter forest, a fragile wooden house suspended above the snow, a legacy that refused to die, and a promise he had no intention of breaking. The morning arrived colder than any Samuel Doyle had yet endured in the northern ridge. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, stretched thin over the world like a piece of ice. The air inside the treehouse had sharpened overnight, and when Samuel exhaled, the breath lingered before fading into the dimness. He rose slowly, his joints protesting, and stood for a long moment in the middle of the room, listening to the quiet thrum of the forest below. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, as though the trees themselves held their breath, waiting for him to take the next step. The words from Tom's diary replayed in his thoughts. Sam will know where to look. He did not feel like a man who knew much of anything anymore, but he trusted the instinct that had saved him countless times before. The ceiling beam, the odd one with the metal brackets, seemed almost to watch him now, as if daring him to uncover what lay hidden inside. He moved a small wooden chair beneath the beam and climbed onto it with effort, steadied himself against the slanted roof, and touched the wood. It was colder than the other beams, smoother, as if it had been sanded or replaced at some point. His fingers traced the nearly invisible seam along its underside. He pressed gently, then harder. Nothing shifted. He fetched his pocket knife, wedged it into the crack, and worked slowly, easing apart what felt like a carefully concealed panel. The knife slipped once, nearly costing him his balance, but he tightened his grip and kept going, prying until the wood finally yielded. The panel swung downward with a soft groan, and a small metal container dropped into his hands. It was heavy, coated in the dust of decades, secured with a clasp that had rusted shut. Samuel carried it to the table and sat down. His hands trembled, not from cold anymore, but from the weight of understanding that something important, perhaps life-changing, rested inside. He used the point of the knife to break the clasp. The metal gave way with a brittle snap. Slowly, carefully, he opened the lid. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in old leather, the edges stiff and curled with age. When he unwrapped it, the air filled with the faint, musty scent of ancient paper. The pages revealed themselves, yellowed, delicate, covered in ink that had aged to a deep brown. The first sheet bore a date, October 1912. Below it were signatures, 4 in total, each written in neat, deliberate handwriting. One was the signature of Tom's grandfather. Another belonged to a representative of the local county. And 2 more, written in characters from a language Samuel did not recognize, belonged to elders of a tribe whose territory had once stretched across these mountains. As he read the text, he felt his heart begin to beat faster. The document stated clearly that the land on which the treehouse stood had been designated an observational and protected territory, entrusted jointly to the Raines family and the tribal elders. Commercial hunting was forbidden on its grounds in perpetuity. Any future ownership transfers required approval from the tribe, and any attempt to change the borders or to integrate the land into a private reserve was declared unlawful. Samuel sat back slowly, staring at the fragile pages, as though they might dissolve if he breathed too harshly. The implications struck him with the force of something immense. Montlake had no right to the land. Not now. Not ever. Whatever arguments he had made, whatever documents he had waved before officials, were lies. And if the men who broke into the shed had been searching for anything, it was surely this. He rose, feeling a steadiness he had not felt in years. The cold that seeped through the floorboards no longer mattered. The forest, the danger, the intimidation, they no longer shook him the way they had before. He had something stronger now than fear. He had truth. He placed the documents back into the metal container and set it on the table, turning over in his mind how best to protect them. Bringing them to the local authorities was pointless. They were too close to Montlake, too easily corrupted or threatened. He would need another route, one that bypassed the local channels entirely. His years in the military had given him one skill above all others: the ability to strategize under pressure. He sat down, folded his hands, and thought it through carefully. Several options presented themselves. The regional newspaper, whose investigative column had once exposed land misuse in a nearby county. The State Historical Society that specialized in preserving heritage sites. The tribal councils that maintained legal rights over ancestral land, and Tom's own attorney, who had already shown a willingness to speak honestly within a room full of suspicious relatives. If Samuel acted swiftly and simultaneously, he could prevent Montlake from silencing the matter before it gained traction. He spent the next 2 hours preparing envelopes. He wrote slowly, but his hand remained steady. One letter explained how he had received the property. Another outlined the suspicious behavior of Montlake's men. In each envelope, he placed detailed descriptions of the events he had witnessed, along with photocopies he made using his small portable scanner, something he had brought out of habit, never expecting it would become vital. Every photocopy was clear enough to prove authenticity if the originals were questioned. He sealed them all with tape, placed the copies in each packet, then tucked the original documents safely into the inner pocket of his jacket. By noon, the sky had darkened again, heavy with the threat of more snow. Samuel packed the letters into his backpack, intending to hike back to his truck and deliver them to a drop box in the nearest town. As he stepped onto the platform outside the treehouse, he froze. Down below, tracks scarred the fresh snow. Long, deep, and recent. Far too recent. He could see them clearly from above. 3 sets of boots circling the clearing, stopping beneath the treehouse, then moving toward the shed again. The shed door hung crookedly now, broken fully off its hinges. Whoever had come last night or this morning had not been searching quietly. A wave of unease washed through him, not because he feared the men returning, but because he understood now what they were willing to do. And with each passing hour, the stakes grew higher. He climbed down the ladder slowly, watching the tree line for movement. The forest was still. Too still. He walked to the shed, looked inside, and found the place completely ransacked. The intruders had taken more than just documents now. They had torn open crates, scattered tools, and left muddy boot prints on the floor. He wondered if they knew what they were looking for, or if they were simply searching for anything that might give Montlake leverage. He returned to the treehouse with urgency, uncertainty pulling at his nerves. If Montlake's men had been here again, they might come back at any moment. He felt the need to leave as soon as possible, while still being cautious. The forest was deep enough to conceal a dozen men if necessary, and he did not intend to walk into an ambush. Before stepping out again, he tucked the original 1912 document even deeper into his inner pocket, wrapped in plastic to guard against moisture. He checked his backpack, tightened the straps, and braced himself. The trek back to his truck was long, but he kept his pace steady, listening for anything unusual. He passed the frozen creek, where broken branches hinted that someone had recently moved through. He crossed the ridge, where he saw the faint marking of a tire, perhaps from a snowmobile. Once he reached the main trailhead, the sense of tension eased slightly. The truck sat where he had parked it, half covered in a thin layer of frost, but undisturbed. He drove cautiously down the narrow, winding path, each bend revealing a landscape blanketed in silent white. When he reached the small mountain town 20 miles south, he parked near the old post office and stepped out, breathing the warmer air with relief. He mailed the packets one by one. With every letter that disappeared into the blue metal slot, he felt as though he were placing pieces of the truth beyond the reach of those who wanted to bury it. He mailed the last envelope, closed the slot, and rested his hand on it for a moment, knowing that now the matter was out of his hands. The documents were no longer his secret alone. They were in the world, moving toward people who could expose what Montlake had hidden for decades. As he turned to leave the post office, something drew his attention. A familiar snowmobile parked across the street. Standing beside it was a tall figure in a black winter coat, the blonde-gray hair unmistakable. Montlake watched him. Samuel felt the pressure of that gaze long before their eyes met. When they finally did, Montlake smiled slowly, deliberately, without warmth. It was the smile of a man who knew something had changed, yet could not see how or when. A smile hiding the first flicker of uncertainty. Samuel kept walking, heading toward his truck. He did not acknowledge the man. He simply opened the door, climbed in, and drove away. It was only once the town faded into the distance and the forest rose once more around him that he realized what had shifted. Montlake no longer knew what Samuel held, and the man's power had always depended on knowing everything, controlling everything. When Samuel returned to the treehouse, the afternoon light had softened into a dim, golden haze. He climbed the ladder slowly, his muscles aching from the long hike and increasing tension of the day. Once inside, he placed the original documents beneath a loose floorboard near the bed, another hiding place he trusted more now that he had reason to believe the roof might be searched again. He had barely settled into a chair when he heard the distant hum of an engine growing louder. Not one engine. Several. Snowmobiles. The sound unmistakable. His body went rigid. He rose, stepped to the window, and peered through a crack in the frost. 3 snowmobiles glided into the clearing, their headlights slicing through the growing dusk. Men dismounted, 4 of them with heavy boots and dark jackets. They did not move toward the ladder. Not yet. They stood in a cluster, speaking to each other. Their posture was unmistakably aggressive. Then another snowmobile arrived. This one, Montlake rode himself. He dismounted with confidence, brushing snow from his coat. He gestured sharply at the men, and they spread out around the clearing like predators circling prey. Only then did Montlake look up at the treehouse, his expression stripped of politeness. "Samuel Doyle," he shouted. "We're going to have a conversation, you and I." Samuel remained inside, his pulse growing steadier, not faster. He watched Montlake like a man studying a map he had already memorized. The forest grew quieter still, waiting. Montlake stepped closer to the ladder. His voice lowered, but carried easily upward. "You think you've complicated things for me? Documents can be contested. Histories can be rewritten. But you—" He stopped speaking. Footsteps approached from behind. Samuel turned to the other window and saw them. 4 figures emerging from the trees. Not Montlake's men, but strangers wearing parkas and snowshoes, carrying cameras and folders. One of them, the leader, wore a badge, identifying him as a representative from the State Historical Society. Another carried the emblem of the Tribal Council. Behind them walked 2 local journalists, their breath clouding in the cold. Montlake's face twisted in confusion. He turned sharply, barking orders at his men. But they hesitated. These new arrivals were not people one could threaten without consequence. The representative from the Tribal Council stepped forward and raised his voice. "Mr. Montlake, you are trespassing on protected land. Any further action you take here will be recorded and submitted as part of our formal complaint." Montlake sputtered, astonished. "Complaint? What complaint?" The man held up a folder. "The complaint based on the evidence submitted this morning." Samuel felt a deep, powerful calm settle over him as he stepped onto the outer platform. He saw Montlake's eyes lift toward him, filled now with disbelief and something dangerously close to fear. Samuel looked down at the man who had tried to bully him, who had threatened him, who had tormented Tom in his final years. His voice was low but strong, carried easily through the cold. "You lost before you even started," he said. "Not because of me, because the truth was here long before you were." Montlake seemed to shrink, as if the snow beneath him had shifted. The journalists recorded every second. The tribal representative spoke into a walkie-talkie. The men Montlake had brought began to back away, uncertain now whether they were committing a crime. Samuel watched the scene unfold, feeling no triumph, only a profound sense of relief. A heaviness lifting from his shoulders, replaced by something quieter, steadier. A promise kept. Hours later, after the snowmobiles vanished into the distance, and the representatives had spoken with him at length, offering support, documentation, and formal protection, Samuel sat alone inside the treehouse. Night had fallen fully now, and the moon cast a thin silver glow across the forest. He lit the small lantern on the table. Its warm light flickered against the walls, revealing the old maps, the notebooks, the beam with its missing panel. The house creaked softly, settling into the cold. For the first time since arriving, Samuel truly felt the presence of the place, not as an inheritance, not as a burden, but as a living echo of promise and legacy. He closed his eyes, leaning back slowly, and imagined Tom sitting across from him, just as they once had across campfires half a world away. "I finished it," Samuel whispered. "We finished it." Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. It sounded almost like an answer. "If you want more stories like this, Subscribe and watch the next videos. Share this one with someone who needs to hear it.